So our idea for this conference was to run an event, bringing together economics educators around the world to discuss some key issues in the field, which are probably relevant to other fields as well. So the second session today after this one is on equipping students with different kinds of skills, something that's going to be, it's going to matter more and more probably in a tight labor market. Tomorrow's sessions are on diversity and inclusivity in economics, again, something that has had a harsh light shone on it in the last few weeks and months. And our last session tomorrow is on making small changes which make a big difference, something that we hope we can do. It's just a couple of things on logistics before we go on to the session for today. So first of all, we would prefer, obviously, Zoom attendees to keep your videos on. It's been great to see people, especially with C3 not happening this year. But for privacy reasons, if you want to turn it off, we understand completely. The sound has been muted for everyone, so please keep it that way just for sound quality. Any questions whatsoever, obviously post them on the chat, and we'll try to answer as many of those as possible. Same thing holds for those of you on YouTube. Please post the questions on chat there. We have part of the team on YouTube as well who feed in the YouTube questions to this session on Zoom as well, so we can feed those into the presenters. So this current session is organized as a plenary panel, always have trouble saying that together, on adaptable teaching in a post-COVID world. And the word adaptable is quite important here, and we've made a conscious choice to go with this word rather than online, remote, high flex, all these other terms that are doing the rounds. And that's because developing a learning design which makes it relatively easy to move between in-person and online activities seems like a smart thing to do, not just in response to the current crisis, but to make higher education more resilient going forward. So our panel today features 4 speakers. We're all distinguished instructors who are going to tell us about their experiences in adapting their courses, what worked, what didn't work, and what they're planning to do going forward. So each speaker will have 5 minutes to present, after which we'll open it up to the Q&A. Like I said before, please feel free to post your questions on the chat as and when you think of them, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. We're going to run till 4 o'clock and then start the breakout rooms for about 15 minutes. And then the next presentation session will start back in this main room at 4:15. If you have questions about any of those logistics, obviously put them on the chat. Okay, so last thing that remains for me to say is to introduce our speakers. So we have James Tierney from Penn State University in the US, Doug McKee from Cornell University, also in the US, Simon Halliday from Smith College, also in the US, bit of a theme here, and representing all of us here in England and elsewhere, Stefania Paredes Fuentes from Warwick University. So I believe we're going to go in that order of speaking. So first up, it's James Tierney. Take it away, James.
Why, hello, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all. Some of you, we've had some happy hours together, and I hope to have more with more of you. I am super excited to be here, and I'm super excited to talk about what I did and what worked and what didn't work. And since I only have 5 minutes, I'm gonna start timing myself right now, so I'll make sure I do it. So, as Prima said, my name is James Tierney. I'm here currently at Penn State University, State College, Pennsylvania, a very small university town that was just announced on Monday that the students will be coming back in full starting in August. We will be ending a little early, ending face-to-face a little early and doing everything online, which I'll talk about a little bit, depending on the class size, et cetera. So you can follow me on the Instagram and the Twitter if you want. It's not all educational on Twitter. There's lots of dumb dad jokes that I post on there too. So before the COVID-19 teaching started, so we're talking, pre-March 13th, I think was the day that Penn State announced that we would not be coming back after spring break. I was teaching 2 sections of Intro to Macro. I had a 200 enrollment and a 250 enrollment. I'm on a 3-3 right now, and my third class is developing an online section for World Campus. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Penn State system, we have University Park, which is the main campus here in State College. That's where myself, Dr. Woot and Dr. Goff that are here, that's where we're at. There's also a ton of, I say a ton, I think 19 Commonwealth campuses, which is the whole Penn State system. And then there's a World Campus, which is focused on distance learning for non-traditional students. And one of my tasks this year was to redevelop the Intro to Macro course. So I had a little bit of a head start, luckily. So I got really lucky that I was teaching Intro to Macro and I was already developing a distance learning platform for Intro to Macro. And I'll talk a little bit about how that helped and how I hope that can help other people think about what an asynchronous classroom is. So pre-COVID-19, that's what I was teaching. And I did weekly My Econ Lab quizzes. I had weekly Pack Back, which is an online discussion board. I did weekly iClickers. I did 3 exams, and I had a final. So there's a ton of assessment that I have built into my class. This section right here, as you can see, there's 6 different buckets is what I call them. Each of those was worth 15%, and I would have dropped the lowest one. So the idea here was dropping the lowest one. Everything looked great. The semester was going awesome. And then spring break happened. I was on a flight back from Florida from spring training, and I knew things were gonna go down. At Penn State, they said, hey, we're not coming back for 3 weeks. And I was like, no, we know that this is gonna be everything. So I'm gonna talk mainly about how I use our learning management system, which is our Canvas, and then I'm more than happy to answer questions when we do the Q&A and also in our small breakouts. So before we started with the distance learning, I broke down Canvas into lessons, and I was gonna have 11 lessons this semester, and the exams would be broken up into 3, 3, 3, and 2 for the final, but the final's cumulative. And it was based off of topics. So first lesson in macro was GDP, and I would give what chapter to read, pages to read, unemployment, inflation, and then there was an exam. And as you can see, the exam was in person. This is a large room of 750 people. It was an evening exam. As I'm pretty sure all of us are going to talk about, assessment is for sure the most difficult part. And it's difficult in person with 500 students, let alone on Canvas. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. Whoops. When I would, so the previous one, each one of these modules on Canvas. So in Canvas's learning management system has a module, and each module I would then break down into a required reading and then related reading. And the required reading, all that stuff is fair game on quizzes, it's fair game on exams. We talk about this stuff in class. The related readings are not required. It's not going to show up on anything, but it's for students who might want to, they might see something, say, hey, I'm interested in baseball, so I want to read that one. And this just gives a little more information for their discussion boards. I left the discussion boards really wide open of whatever you want to talk about, as long as it pertains a little bit, some way to economics. So my Canvas was really bare bones before we went to emergency teaching. So now let's go ahead for the last minute and talk about what we did. Oh, and beforehand it was really straightforward for my exams, 30 multiple choice, 30 graphing, and short answers. Post-COVID, asynchronous for the win. And I'm going to talk a lot about why asynchronous is, in my opinion, is the way we need to go for these large lectures. And I know my co-presenters are going to talk about why I'm wrong, and that's perfectly fine. That's what I like about this. So I went asynchronous right away. Now, again, I had a little bit of a head start because I was already developing an asynchronous course for World Campus. I kept everything the same except for weekly iClickers. I did these checkpoint quizzes within Canvas. And I'll show you my Canvas here in a second. Notice how instead of it being a topic, I went to weeks. So week 11, week 13, week 14. And the exam week was only the exam, giving time for students to ask questions and do everything. So we flipped from going topic by topic to week by week. And I would post everything on Monday morning and have everything due Sunday night. When we would split out this module, like for week 12, you'd see there would be a lot of text. So all of these where you don't see the link, these are all text. And it's probably 2-3 paragraphs, what you would expect if you were recording a lecture and people were just reading the transcript. So the course designer that I'm working with for our online course talks about how most students right now for these long lectures, 7, 8, 10, 15 minutes, they're just downloading the transcripts and reading it. So we're putting most of this, I'm putting most of this into words. And then I use a lot of media in my classrooms. There's no, a lot of you do as well. And I was putting those videos just embedded right here in Canvas and saying, this is the next thing you go to. Okay, what is money? And then there's a quick 30-second thing from Weekend Update on SNL. 4 functions of money, there's a medium of exchange thing. So that's the way we split it up that way. I also made a ton of videos on YouTube, and these are all, as you can see, quite short videos. So the idea of an asynchronous classroom to me is not 45 minutes of me in front of a whiteboard doing everything out. It's saying, okay, we want to just show a monetary policy during a recession using aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Okay, so this way we can talk about what are we going to do if we want to, if we want to pull back on prices, if we want to help with unemployment, if we want to be dove, we want to be a hawk, but it's all done in just 2 to 3 minutes. A 5-minute is probably the longest video that I had for the students.
Sorry, James, we're going to have to.
Yep, nope, I got it.
Oh,
I'm sorry. And that was my last slide. Well, I just changed the exams a little bit. So there you go.
Perfect. Thanks very much, James. That was great. We are already starting to get questions. So please, if I can remind you, keep sending questions and I'll call them out at the end. Our next speaker is Doug McKee from Cornell. Doug, you might be muted.
I'm just sharing my screen. And of course, it decides right now not to work. It's not terribly convenient. All right, hold on. We're almost there.
Okay.
You don't see any slides, do you?
No, Doug, no slides.
It's amazing that it can work all semester long and then decide to fail now. There we go. All right. Hey, everybody. I'm pretty excited to be here too. And when James says that I'm going to disagree with him on a lot of stuff, it's true. And I'm going to start right off with a statement he had on one of his slides that he's bad at branding. Because he's great at branding because he remembers to put his blog on the website or on his slides. And so if you want to read more of what I have to think about, what I have to say about teaching, you can go to my blog. And occasionally I post on Twitter at TeachBetterCO, but I think that with this audience, most of you that want to follow me are probably already following me, so don't stress too much about that. All right, so when all of this started, I was in the middle of teaching a large, and when I say large, it's not exactly the same as what James means. I had about 130 students teaching them, and I was teaching them applied econometrics. This is a course that I've taught many times before, and it's become quite interactive over time. I do lecture in class, but only about 40% of the class time. And the rest of the time in class is spent with students working on solving specific problems or working in small groups on activities. Those groups, I assign students to small groups where a small group is 4 or 5 students at the very beginning of the semester, and they work in those groups in class as well as outside class on problem sets and on a semester-long project where they analyze some data and come up with their own question. They're randomly assigned, although I make sure not to isolate underrepresented minorities or women, which I know science, hard science classes has had a problem with those kinds of groups. All right. when I made the transition, instead of deciding to go asynchronous, what I wanted to do was maintain as much of the interactivity as I had in class. So the goal was to basically replicate as much of the structure of the class as I possibly could. I've told you a little bit about what happened in the class. Outside class, the students did online quizzes, actually pretty similar to what James is talking about. We used Canvas as our learning management system. Those quizzes incentivize students to actually do the reading and review their notes. They're not pre-reading quizzes, they're post-reading quizzes. So at the end of each week-long module, they do that. And then support in a real class, in the in-person class, students would come to office hours, either mine or my TAs, and we also had an online discussion board. Okay. Now the lecturing, what I decided to do was give my lectures in Zoom, very much like I'm doing right here. And what this let me do is it let me take questions in real time. Okay, so just like a student would raise their hand in the middle of a class and ask a question, they could do the same by pressing the raise hand button or just yelling out if they wanted to. It scaled up pretty well, actually. I would say it was that part was pretty successful. And then I was able to react to those questions and either slow things down or speed things up. And similarly, just like I can see a lot of you and I can react to you, I was doing the same thing there. I could see their nonverbal reactions and it felt pretty natural. Okay. Now, as far as the individual problem solving, again, in class, they used iClicker. And this semester, I actually switched to not allowing them to use the hardware clicker. I wanted them to use the app on their phone or their iPad or their computer so that I could ask more open-ended questions rather than just A, B, C, D, E. And that worked out quite well for this because those apps, they work great no matter where you are in the world. So that didn't change at all. The small groups was a pretty key part of the in-person class, and I came pretty close to replicating that with Zoom breakout rooms. And the key there for my class was to, instead of randomly assigning students to breakout rooms, the small groups that I assigned at the very beginning of the semester, I was able to pre-assign those students to the same rooms. They downloaded the materials that they needed ahead of time. I would put them on the course websites, and then they would work on their problems together in the breakout room. I would wander the room along with my TAs. We would wander the room. We would respond to calls for help. The Zoom breakout room feature has a nice button where they just say call for help, and I get a dialogue and I can go straight there. The user interface is pretty clean. And in an online environment, I felt like that peer-to-peer interaction that the students were having every day in class was really important to them because they were pretty isolated at home. I mean, most of them had some family members, but I know if I was stuck with my parents in a house for several months, I would go crazy also. So it was nice for them to be able to actually talk to peers.
Sorry, don't have very much time left. 30 seconds or so.
All right. The online quizzes and the additional support stayed almost exactly the same. Just office hours were held in Zoom. The discussion board didn't change at all. It was maybe a little bit busier. And as James said also, I would say the biggest challenge was assessments. And I'll stop there. And then we can talk, I'm sure we're going to talk more about assessments in the Q&A. And I think Steffi's going to spend most of her time talking about assessments as well. So how'd I do, Brahma?
Perfect. Thank you, Doug. There's a lot to talk about now. I'm getting lots and lots of questions. So that's all good. Let's turn over to Simon now.
Okay. Okay, can everyone see? We can see the slides. Okay. Okay, I thought very empty London streets would be a useful like a comparison for thinking about very empty classrooms. So there's a picture of empty London. So a couple things. What I'm going to talk about is not a story of perfection. It is very much not a prescription about what you should be doing. And in fact, if I think about the spring semester, this is kind of the metaphor that I think about with this really bucking horse and me trying to ride it out. So it's just some reflections on what I did and what I think, well, to some extent worked and didn't work. So what did I do? First things first, I cut content. I tried to also act flexibly and nimbly. What I mean by this too, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is that I had an initial sense of what I did subsequent to the spring semester, I say the spring break. And then I updated my syllabi, which I'll provide to you in links later. Having updated my syllabi, I had some sense of what I expected to do after spring break. But then in interaction with the students, I continuously updated my expectations about what I expected of myself and what I expected of them. And very importantly, we tried to maintain communication there about what those looked like. I used a kind of overlapping set of tools, which included Slack, which I'll show you in a second, Poll Everywhere, which you can use in Slack itself and on your slides, and lots of use of Google Docs and Google Slides, both by me and by my students. Similar to James, I used asynchronous short videos, not quite as many as he did. I had ones often explaining mathematics or certain brief discussions of academic papers. And then we had synchronous discussions and what I would think of as kind of mini lectures. So typically nothing that would take longer than say 10 or 15 minutes. And what would typically happen at that point was that I would have breakout rooms for my classes that were pre-assigned in a similar way to what Doug had. I was teaching two courses, economic development and behavioral economics. So both of these are pretty well disposed towards thinking about discussing things in small groups to small tasks and basic exercises. They were pretty small this semester, 20 students in each class about, so nowhere near as large as what James was dealing with. Okay, so in case you haven't seen Zoom before, so this is a screenshot blurred out of what was going on in my economic development class. So what would often happen during class is that I would pose a question, then students would respond in a stream, as you can kind of see here that they were doing. Now, one of the things about why I used this rather than Zoom chats was that in the Zoom chat, for sure it makes a transcription at the end of the class, but students can't respond to questions afterwards. They can't access it as easily. They can get the copy of the text, but they can't interact with it in any way. And so one of the things I like about Slack is that students can go back to previous questions, continue to interact with it, ask me questions, and ask each other questions about that. So that's one important thing which I really value about Slack and which I found super helpful. I've also historically used Piazza, but I just tend to prefer Slack these days. Then something else which is incredibly important in my behavioral economics class is students have to code in R. And so if you're doing anything to do with coding, so here I've blurred out student names, but what you can see is they were trying to reproduce the tables from specific published papers, and then they could put in the code. I could then see what they're doing, and then I can respond to them. So the student here was copy pasting some code, then someone else you can see on the side there, they'd made something. I couldn't tell what they were doing. They sent me some documents, and then we can interact to and fro in that respect. So if you're doing anything involving code, I again prefer Slack to Piazza and some other platforms. But there's a variety of different solutions that can work for you. So here are some brief summaries. I'm going to tweet out my slides in a second, but a couple things here. In my development economics course, I cut 3 chapters. I had 2- and 3-person presentations based on poor economics, so the book by Banerjee and DeFlo. I originally had team projects. Those got switched to being individual reports. I originally had a take-home exam. That got split up into 3 weekly exercises. I originally had presentations they were given a team, that got changed to individual meetings that students had with me. And I used breakout rooms for students to discuss poor economics before they presented it to the class. In behavioral economics, I cut 2 topics that we were originally going to cover in terms of academic readings and topics in the textbook. I cut a lab exercise. I cut an experiment report. I kept my team projects, which are a bit harder to manage. I can talk a little bit about that if people have questions later. And I split what was originally going to be a take-home exam into 4 weekly exercises split over 4 weeks. And I used breakout rooms for paper discussions and team meetings. So those are just a couple things that I did to adapt quickly. And I said I was trying to be nimble. But something that I would like to highlight for you all is the following problem. I think there is a moral burden on us as instructors during this time. Our students are under incredible pressure, and they also have new burdens. I had students with sick friends and sick family. They had to engage in care work they weren't asked to do previously. They had to have jobs that they didn't have previously. I had that happen to a variety of students who went home. And there is dramatic inequality in how these burdens are shared among our students. Our poor students and our students of color are much more likely to have to bear these burdens than wealthier and typically white students. So just something for you to think about when you're doing this. One of the reasons I specifically chose to cut some content and to alleviate some of my teaching expectations was that the students were just in a very dire position. And I think they could still get some of the very core values that I wanted them to have out of my course without me covering everything. And so what I would encourage you to do as you go into the autumn or the fall and then next spring is think, what are the very core values, the most important ideas that my course has to convey? And what are the things that I can cut if I need to? And so I spent a long time during the spring break thinking about what those core values were for my course and my courses and what I could cut to make sure that my students still got those core messages. Things I haven't tried, but I'm planning to put together weekly schedules for my students. I haven't worked out exactly how I'm going to do this yet, but I want to kind of give them a weekly plan about what I think they should allocate their hours to. A certain amount for videos that I give them, a certain amount for reading, a certain amount for exercise. That's what I expect for a given week. Haven't tested it yet. It's what I hope to do in the future. I want to have better and I want to have more short videos along the lines of what James was suggesting. I've done stuff with my iPad and with a light board. I've bought some stuff to do things like Abdullah has, he's done some great videos. I'm hoping to do similar things too. Now, very importantly, if you're using new technology, coach your students, coach your students, coach your students. Even if they're digital natives, it does not mean they know how to use the technologies that we're using. So please find time and space to coach your students on their use. 2 books I'm reading. I'll tweet out these slides so you can get these links later. Small Teaching Online and Tips for Creating Successful Videos. I just recently bought the ebooks of these and I'll be using them. And so not all of these links are corrected yet. I didn't quite manage to get all of them. When someone asked a question about syllabi, I tried to just quickly add this to my slides and I didn't have quite enough time to put all the links in, but I'll put them in the next few minutes. You can get hold of me at sholliday@smith.edu, at Simon D. Holliday on Twitter and simondholliday.com. And then I'll have these links live in the next sort of 10 or 15 minutes about my original syllabus for the course, my updated syllabus after spring break, and then for my lower level elective economic development, a document I had with my students, which was my continuously updating expectations. Thanks so much. I look forward to your questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Simon. And lots of questions coming in. So we'll move straight away to Steffi. Actually, Simon, if you could put the names of the books in the chat as well, that would be super. Go ahead, Steffi. Steffi, You can't hear me yet?
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going for almost 2 minutes now. Thank you very much. That was very useful. I was saying that, as you might be aware, for the people in the UK, we were almost at the end of our teaching. So really our problems were about assessments. So I learned a lot about how to prepare for my teaching for next year, but I'm gonna talk to you about what I did when I have to change my assessments from like in a few weeks. And so I started to use this. I went back to Bloom's taxonomy and I said, well, something that we do need to consider here is that when we are going to be moving to remote assessments, these are going to be open book and students are going to have access to all the resources. So we need to be creative in how we set up assessments. So we know that at least in the UK, our final assessments tend to be mostly exams, final year exams, and they are quite heavy in the sense that for students represents like between 60 and 100% of the mark for a module, which is quite a lot. So in that sense, I have to set up questions that help students or ask students to create, evaluate, and analyze things. And not because remembering, understanding, and applying are not important, but it is because once you can create, evaluate, and analyze means that you are also engaging, remembering, understanding, and applying. And I know this sounds very abstract, so I'm giving you some examples if this works. Sorry. Okay, so for instance, for my year 3 applied macroeconomics, this is a very small module, very specialist, so I only had around 20 students. I changed my assessment to a 48 hours exam. And this is one of the questions for the exam, it's 50 marks, and the students had to write a policy brief. I gave word count, and this is very important. Remember, if you are setting remote assessments, give word counts because it makes the marking load much easier for you. And I gave them 2 topics. I have to choose one of these 2 topics. Of course, they are based on the lectures that we did for applied macroeconomics, and we did lectures on inequality, and in particular, inequality in the UK. So similarly, for another module, I have a few more students. I have a bit more of a mix. So you can see here we have 2 questions. And even if these are kind of smaller questions, 15 marks each, they still require students to use their knowledge and put various pieces of knowledge from the course together to provide a very good answer to these questions. So what I found is then what I did, the students finished the exam the last week. So I sent a survey to my students, the ones who sat these 2 assessments, to see how they find it, because I think that a lot of you are worried about students cheating or students finding too easy these assessments or students not studying enough for remote assessments. And I didn't think of that before I set them, but I'm even more convinced now that remote assessment, they don't mean easier, and it doesn't mean that the students cheat a lot. Actually, I would say that you can see many students found it more difficult and even more stressful, but I want to say a bit more about this, why they find it more stressful. It's not necessarily about the content, but it was about a lot of the technology behind the remote assessment. So we need to be very careful on how we set this. The other thing that I asked the students was, and again, this is not working. Yeah, sorry. Is what they prefer. If they have to choose between, I gave them few choices, and one of the choices was invigilated exams, so the exams that they sit in the classroom. You can see that a lot of them, they still prefer to sit invigilated exams. And the reason that they found this is because many of the remote assessments that they did, they found it very stressful, especially the technology that they have to use. Although so what my university did is that they moved a lot of these invigilated exams into what they call time-limited online exams. So the students had 2 or 3 hours to finish the exam since they accessed the exam. So I think that was very stressful. I opted out of that and I gave students 24 or 48 hours to finish. From when I released the exam, they have 24 or 48 hours to finish. I have to say, I think that worked quite well because here it is, the students actually commented very positively about it. Remember that in economics, we have to use sometimes a lot of formulas and a lot of graphs. Putting the graph and the formulas into the Word document that the students have to then upload into the exam portal was very complicated. And the students found that part very stressful. And for that reason, they say, I would rather sit the exam in the classroom. However, with the 24-hour format or the 48-hour, they found it that they could actually apply the knowledge. And so that was quite good. So what did I learn? If I have to take 2 things out of this, is that it's just good practice in general, even if we go back to sitting exams in a classroom, is to design questions that go beyond remembering material from lectures or books. And another thing that you might wonder is about cheating. Does cheating happen more in remote assessments? I don't think so. Does it happen? Yes, it might have happened. But cheating does happen during invigilated exams too. And I have no evidence that much cheating happened during my exams. I have very low Turnitin scores. There is a lot of answers, so the students don't think that they have the same answers, or they don't even communicate too much. We have a mark distribution, at least in my exams, that is very similar to what I had last year. So I think good assessment design can help to mitigate this a lot. And finally, I just wanted, it's not just you that are worried about cheating and plagiarism, students are worried too. So something that I am going to do next year, if I do remote assessments, is to communicate with students how I plan to deter from this and why I don't believe there is much happening. So I'm gonna communicate how the design of the assessment helps with this, because they are worried about this too. I think that's all what I have to say.
Perfect, thank you very much. So lots of questions coming up. So I'm gonna maybe start with the sort of broader questions, which are for everyone. So I'll start with the question actually, which relates to what Steffi ended up with. And so because she's answered it kind of already, it's to the 3 gentlemen. What, if you have information on it yet, did you think happened to GPAs, to results in your tests, teaching evaluations, and so on? James, do you want to start?
Sure. So Penn State, this is also asked in the chat, Penn State went to pass, no pass. Students could decide that after they got their final exam grades and their final semester grades. So my GPA with that skyrocketed, but that's because pretty much everybody that was, you know, a B- or lower just took the pass. But even when I looked at my final grades, my GPA did go up. My GPA is usually about a 2.7 for my intro to macro, and that went up to about a 3.1, which was the highest that I've had. Now, with that being said, the way I organized my classes, I was planning on dropping their lowest exam, and all 3 of my in-class exams are very, very difficult. But they took 1 in-class exam and then 2 online, and the 2 online were much higher grades, so almost everyone dropped their first exam. So yeah, so that's what I did. My teaching evals were pretty much right on par, but a lot lower number of students filled them out because I didn't push them, because the university said they weren't going to be used for anything. So I found no incentive to add additional stress to my students.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, James. Doug?
Yeah, so okay, a lot of questions there. For assessment, I converted so normally I would give a 2-stage exam that was a weighted average between an individual exam, and then they retake the whole exam in their small groups. Because I didn't believe, I wanted to give similar exams, but I didn't believe that if I told them they wouldn't not to collaborate, that they wouldn't collaborate. Even if 20% of them actually, or even if 80% of them actually followed the rule, I didn't want to tax the other 20%. And so I just allowed them to take the exam, the prelim exam, the midterm exam that we happened to did online as a group. We had a long discussion about this in class between the students, and I would poll them about different options. The final exam, because the grades were just so high on that prelim exam, I made the final exam a little bit harder, and I added a multiple choice piece where they had to, I had a large pool of questions, and I think about 50 questions, and each student got a randomly generated exam that had 10 questions. When they started that exam, they only had 30 minutes to answer those questions. They weren't terribly hard, but there was a much bigger range on those questions. And so I didn't weight it particularly high in their final exam. So grades overall were much higher than usual. Usually the median grade I assign is a B+. This semester it was an A. But I don't curve. And so I wanted to be true to that. At Cornell, students could choose to take any class they wanted, pass, fail, right up until the very last minute after the exam. So not too many of my students did that, but the few low grades that there were, they chose to do that. I'm sure I'm not answering some of the questions that were raised.
There's lots of questions, so that's fine on that one. And I would say if the speakers can also keep a track on have a look at the chat also, there are some specific questions that will come on. But Simon, do you want to quickly tell us about any effects on GPA and student evaluations if you've gotten them yet, or they were run at all?
Wait, Simon, before you start, my course evaluations were the highest they've ever been this semester.
Well, that's good to know. So whatever the changes were that you made, assessments, whatever, they were okay.
And I give a standard assessment that's the same every year, that's no stakes. And the scores on that were about the same as they've been for the last few years. So that I think is evidence that they did actually learn some of the material. Okay.
Perfect, thank you. Simon.
So just quickly on course evals or comments. So I had kind of bimodal comments. One, basically students thought I was one of the most prepared for the changeover, but that my expectations for the amount of work were actually still too high. And so depending on the students' individual preferences, so some students appreciated that I still maintained certain expectations, others thought that I still expected too much. But that, I knew that was gonna happen. In terms of the work that they had to do, I explicitly, similarly to Doug, I think I explicitly actually encouraged them to team up to answer the questions, because the questions in my take-home midterm were just damn hard. And so the thing that I valued most, and they could ask questions about the midterm questions, exercises that they became called in Slack. And there was so much learning that happened there, where one student would pose a question, someone else would answer, I would add something else. And then a student was like, oh, I completely misunderstood this. What you're actually thinking about is X, Y, Z. And then another student would follow up. And so I care about that learning more than I care about the grading, but obviously I'm in this luxury position of being at a liberal arts college where I don't have to grade everyone. I don't have 200 students to grade. So yes, I understand that that's a very specific position that we're in that context, and that having been in larger classrooms previously, I know that other students would free ride for sure in that same context. But I genuinely don't know what to do about, let's say that 10 or 20% of students who would choose to free ride. But I think that many students, if we trust them, they will actually do hard learning work. maybe I'm being too kind.
That's great. Thank you, Simon. I think, Steffi, hopefully you're looking at the chat. There's a lot of questions about collaboration and incentivizing people and so on and so forth that have come up and which we're constantly in discussion about. I think one of the issues that to consider is that there's a, inclusivity angle to this, that some people may be more able to collaborate, get help, and so on. I don't know what the answer is, but just to flag that that is an issue, just like Simon was talking about sort of access to learning, but access to help for assessment as well. Not a question, absolutely a comment. So we have about 10 minutes to go before we have our breakout room. One of the things that, so I'm going to ask here is that came out for everyone was, so, despite the discussion that we had early on about sync versus async, all of you pretty much had some mix of sync and async, right? A little more and a little less. So the two questions there were, first of all, how do you decide which bits of the content that you take sync and which bits you take async, which you would normally just deliver in a lecture or something. And then secondly, and I think Simon touched on this briefly, do you give students an indication of for the async ones, how much time you're supposed to spend? Is there any kind of sort of workload modeling almost for students? James, do you want to go first because you're the async guy?
Sure. I will say that my initial fear for going synchronous was that the technology hadn't been tested and I didn't want to add more stress. So my fear of Zoom bombing, my fear of people not being able to access things was really high. And I figured that I could still deliver the material in a way where the benefit outweighed those costs. Of course, now that all that stuff has been, a lot of that stuff has been figured out, perhaps the costs are a little lower. But then as I started talking to more and more students, my biggest fear came with not providing the same level of signaling to my international students and my students who may not be able to attend synchronous classes, because I could say, hey, we're going to do synchronous classes, and but if you can't make it, it's okay. We'll be recording it and giving it to you. And that sounds good until you really think about it. Of like, that's sending a signal like, oh, you can't be here, so we need to have it here because it's so much better. And if you're not here, I guess you can still get this second class type of thing. And I really felt like, as a first generation college student, like if I had to go home and had to work, and then I would just feel so put down that all these other students who might have the ability to attend these synchronous classes and participate in these discussion boards live, like they have this leg up on me already. And that just it made me feel not great. So that was my decision. Of course, it would be so much easier to control that if it was, 20, 25 students and mainly students that are living on campus. And perhaps this semester it might be easier for a place like Penn State when they're bringing students back. But if I'm going to continue to have 20 to 25% international students that aren't going to be here in town and just be like, oh, well, I'm sorry, it's 2 a.m. where you are, but it's okay, I'll record it. Like, I don't feel comfortable with that. So with the what did I make videos versus what did I go text? I thought back to my lectures and I said, when was I lecturing where really all I was doing was showing some bullet points on slides? Can I put that into a quick 5 to 10 minute read for students and then break that up? And it is very similar to a textbook. I saw someone say that, and that was my biggest concern when I first started developing online courses for World Campus, was that I was just rewriting the textbook. But the idea was to rewrite the textbook with my personal voice, so students were hearing it from who they were seeing the videos from, because students really enjoy, like, how am I presenting that material? And the textbook reading was still required, and there was overlap, which there is with all of our lectures. And students commented both ways. They were like, hey, I didn't read the textbook because your stuff, or some people were like, hey, I just read the textbook. But I got a lot of students that were like, oh, it was great to hear the way you explained it once I had already read it. And so that was kind of my soapbox of why I went the way I did.
That's a great answer, actually. And the thing is, I think, we miss a lot of the sort of equality issues that come up in a lot of these things, unless you're sort of actively thinking about them and actively trying to do something about it. I'm not sure what the answers are for many of these things, but if we're thinking about them, hopefully we can do something about that. I mean, I'll let the others also weigh in if you can, but there was another thing I wanted to sort of just add in to here was that in line with sort of what we've said about both learning and teaching and assessment and so on, were you guys doing anything explicitly to encourage or build student communities within sort of, you know, what they would have in class where they sat down next to someone and said hello or whatever, with sort of curricular communities, essentially. So I know, I mean, Simon talked about Slack, you guys, Doug had Piazza. Doug, do you want to go? You had your hand up?
Okay, so to answer that first, creating the small groups at the beginning of the semester, randomly assigning them, it forces, it imposes a bunch of people that students have to work with and get comfortable with. And that actually, I think it pays off hugely in an in-person class, but I think it was even more important actually in the online class. The students, they got to know each other in person at the beginning of the semester. I will likely teach this class online in the fall, and it's going to be a little trickier, and I will have to do more work to invest to make sure that those groups all gel. But the key is to assign them at the beginning and then have them do lots of things in those groups. And I think that's really important.
So just to clarify, these were the Zoom breakout rooms.
Well, I mean, I did use those groups in the Zoom breakout rooms, but they were also encouraged to work on problem sets together, and they would work on exams together, and they would work on this project all semester together. And my experience is they do that a lot. They take full advantage of that. As far as what James was saying, I mean, I hate to say it, but I felt like the students that couldn't attend the synchronous lectures, they had the recordings. And the recordings, I don't want to sell these recordings short because so many, I think there were many students that really valued the recordings because they were able to slow them down, pause them, and watch them whenever they wanted. I haven't like really closely looked at the feedback and who attended, but my intuition, not my intuition, but looking at who attended the course, and I would say we had about, by the end, say 50 to 55% of students actually attending. It wasn't only the white students that were showing up. It did seem like a pretty good mix. Now, the nice about Zoom is I've got the data, so I know exactly who showed up and when they did. So I can go back and look and see who didn't show up. And I'll do that before I do this again. The international students, there weren't all that many. There were a few in Europe. I taught my class in the afternoon, so they weren't put out at all in terms of being the middle of the night. But the 10 students I had in East Asia were put out. And they tended to watch the video instead. Stop.
Yeah, I mean, this is the issue that we have as well. I'm going to quickly bring in Steffi, if you're able to sort of comment on this really quickly, because we have a huge proportion of our students in East Asia. And so pretty much everyone has to teach at 3 p.m. London time, which obviously means everyone's on Moodle or on, you know, wherever they're teaching through at that time, which is not doable, I think, probably. Otherwise, I guess the issue is, you know, we don't want to systematically leave out students who are in a particular time zone, right? As long as we're not doing that and you choose not to attend or whatever it is, that's your own thing. Steffi, did you guys have similar experience?
So about teaching in general, you mean, or you're on mute?
Synchronous versus asynchronous and sort of timetabling issues and so on.
Yeah, so regarding exams, so what we did for those ones who set up time limited 2-3 hours exams, students have 2-3 hours from the moment they open the exam. So they have a window of 24 hours to access the exam. And then once they open it, they had 24 hours to finish it. I personally opted out of that one because I thought like it could be stressful if the students have to add graphs and equations. And I thought like for my modules at 24 hours, 48 hours worked better. So, and I think both of this, in both scenarios, you can address a bit of the time zones issues. it was just more the technical part that I wasn't convinced of.
Yep, sounds good. Sorry, I know we have lots of other things happening, but and questions and answers and so on, but we are about to go into breakout rooms, and the presenters will also be in the breakout rooms, and the chat continues, obviously. So do feel free to continue this discussion in the breakout rooms. I think Maddie will start them automatically just about now, and then you're going to be coming back directly here, or you can opt out of the breakout room at any time. If you want, do remember in 15 minutes, we're starting back again at this link with the next session.